They were the heirs to one of the most feared regimes in the Middle East. Known for their brutality and savagery, Saddam Hussein's sons, Uday and Qusay, held absolute power over Iraq's citizens for years. But what happened in the final hours of their lives will shock you. This is the story of betrayal, chaos, and a brutal end they didn't see coming. To understand the true horror behind the execution of Saddam Hussein's sons, we first need to understand who they were and the powerful roles they played in their father's brutal regime. Saddam's iron grip on Iraq wasn't just sustained by his ruthlessness, but also by the two men destined to inherit his kingdom, Uday and Qusay. Uday Hussein, the older of the two, was known for his sadistic and violent tendencies. In charge of the Iraqi Olympic Committee, Uday used his position to torture athletes who didn't meet his expectations. His psychopathic tendencies made even seasoned military officials fear him. He was the embodiment of uncontrolled power, his name synonymous with terror. Uday Hussein, the eldest son, was often described as a man consumed by violence and sadism. From an early age, he showcased a deep desire for power and control, using his father's influence to terrorize anyone who crossed his path. Known for his erratic behavior, Uday was infamous for attending lavish parties, often fueled by alcohol and drugs, where he would unleash his brutality on guests and servants alike. One story that exemplifies his cruelty was the murder of his father's close aide in 1988. A crime so shocking that even Saddam temporarily distanced himself from his son. Uday's love for fast cars, designer suits, and indulgence stood in stark contrast to the suffering of the Iraqi people, who lived under the oppressive rule of the Hussein regime. Uday Hussein, on the other hand, was more calculated. Cold, quiet, and deadly, Qusay was Saddam's right-hand man when it came to military operations. He led Iraq's Republican Guard and the intelligence service, managing the inner workings of Saddam's oppressive regime. In many ways, Qusay was more dangerous than his volatile older brother. Uday Hussein was far less public than Uday, but equally terrifying in his ruthlessness. Where Uday was impulsive, Qusay was calculating, running the nation's feared internal security apparatus and military intelligence with cold precision. He was responsible for overseeing mass executions, torture of dissidents, and the repression of Kurdish uprisings in the north. Qusay's personality was defined by his loyalty to the regime, always putting Saddam's goals above everything else. His rise to power, particularly over the elite Republican Guard, cemented his position as a key figure in the survival of the Hussein dynasty. Both brothers, in their own ways, represented the darkest sides of Saddam's rule. April 2003, the US invasion of Iraq led to the swift fall of Baghdad. The regime that ruled Iraq for decades came crumbling down as US forces closed in. Saddam Hussein disappeared into the shadows, but his sons, they were on the run, hiding from the coalition forces that were closing in on them. But it wasn't just the Americans they had to worry about. The people of Iraq, who had long suffered under their tyranny, were ready for revenge. The price on their heads was high, and betrayal was brewing close to home. As the war raged on, Uday and Qusay fled to Mosul, a northern Iraqi city. With their loyal bodyguards, they sought refuge in the home of a family that once benefited from the Hussein regime. But in times of war, loyalty often comes at a price. By mid-July 2003, the Americans were hunting down every high-ranking member of the Hussein regime. Posters with the faces of Uday, Qusay, and Saddam himself littered the streets of Iraq. The US military had promised hefty rewards to anyone who provided credible information on the whereabouts of these fugitives. And then it happened. A family member of the owners of the house where Uday and Qusay were hiding decided to turn them in, perhaps motivated by the $30 million bounty on their heads. $15 million for each son. He passed on the intel to the US forces. On July 22, 2003, the location was confirmed, and Task Force 20, a special operations group, was given the green light to take them down. The house where Uday and Qusay were hiding was a fortified villa, but for US troops this was no ordinary raid. Task Force 20, accompanied by the 101st Airborne Division and Apache helicopters, approached the villa cautiously. They knew the kind of men they were dealing with, men who would rather die than be captured. As the troops moved in, they were met with fierce resistance. A firefight erupted. Uday, Qusay and their loyal bodyguards were heavily armed, ready for a brutal last stand. The battle that followed lasted over 4 hours. Despite repeated calls for surrender, Uday and Qusay refused to give in. They were cornered but determined to go out fighting. US forces then made a crucial decision. They fired several tow missiles at the building, leveling parts of it. As the dust settled, the troops moved in for the kill. When the dust finally cleared, the bodies of Uday and Qusay were found. Both men had been killed in the firefight. Their bullet-riddled bodies were barely recognizable. But the Americans knew they had just eliminated 2 of the most wanted men in the world. But this wasn't the end of the story. To prove to the world and to the Iraqi people that Uday and Qusay were truly dead, the US made a controversial decision. They released graphic photos of their corpses. These images shocked the world, but for many Iraqis, it was a moment of relief, a symbol that the Hussein era was finally over. But despite their violent deaths, the legacy of Uday and Qusay Hussein lives on in the memories of the people who suffered under their rule. The brothers were responsible for some of the most heinous crimes in modern history. Uday, infamous for his ruthless punishments and twisted desires, was often called a madman by those who knew him. Torture and murder were daily occurrences for the man who saw himself as untouchable. His private life was a nightmare for anyone unlucky enough to cross his path. Qusay, though less flamboyant than his brother, was no less dangerous. His leadership in Iraq's brutal military machine oversaw the torture and execution of thousands. The quiet, calculated killer was an essential pillar in Saddam's regime. So, what they never told you about the rough execution of Saddam Hussein's sons is this. Despite their power, their resources and their brutality, it wasn't a grand military maneuver that led to their downfall. It was betrayal. Betrayal by those they trusted in their final moments. And when the world saw their bodies displayed for all to see, it was a reminder that no matter how powerful or feared a person may be, they are not invincible. Uday and Qusay Hussein died the way they lived, in violence, chaos, and surrounded by the destruction they themselves had caused. The death of Saddam Hussein's sons marked the end of an era of terror for Iraq, but their story serves as a stark reminder of how power, when abused, can lead to a brutal and unforgiving downfall. The Hussein dynasty crumbled, but its bloody legacy will forever be etched in the pages of history. Thank you for watching. Make sure to like, comment and subscribe for more deep dives into the untold stories from history. Until next time, stay curious.